Alright, welcome back to Dr. Logic Awkwardly Does Logic in Her Office, Part 2. No one told me that my video recording software would stop working after half an hour. So, we got to the point where I was going to give you an example argument from Shankar Swarman's Nyaya Pravesha. The thesis is that there's fire on the mountain. Fire is the sadhya, the target property. The mountain is the paksha, the subject. The ground is because there is smoke. Having smoke is the hetu. And then we have the warrant. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire. So wherever there is smoke, there is fire. This is the statement of the positive concomitance or the pervasion. But what Shankar Swarman and Dignaga are going to add to the standard three-part structure that Vasubandhu had is the notion of the example. So this becomes codified into the structure of the argument, and you will have at least a positive example. So that knocks out the second step of the Trirupa Hetu, preferably also with a negative example, which knocks out the third part of the Trirupa Hetu. So these examples are called, and this is one of the excellent Sanskrit words that we will come across in this lecture, the Drishtanta. So where else will you ever see four consonants in a row? In this case, we can give a positive example like a kitchen. So a kitchen is a place that shows the concomitance of smoke and fire. So there is smoke in a kitchen and there's also fire. And then the negative example is going to be like a lake. So there is no smoke and there's no fire on a lake. So there is actually smoke. The hetu is present in the paksha, so the hetu is not undemonstrated. It occurs in some it positively occurs in some similar examples, like in a kitchen, and there's negative co-occurrence in the negative Drishtanta, like at a lake. Or one way we could probably say it more clearly, unlike a lake. So neither fire nor smoke occur in the lake. Now, this incorporating of the Drishtanta, both positive and negative, into the structure of the argument gives us a firmer, stronger structure for the argument. We no longer have to worry about whether or not our justification is warranted because it's built into the argument itself, because we can cite these examples. This is all connected to something that is found in more than one different logical text of this period, and it's called the Wheel of Reasons. It articulates the different connections that you can have between a hetu and a sadhya. So what are the cases in which you have the actual necessary concomitance relation between the two? So we're going to draw, it's going to be more of a grid than a wheel, but the hetu can occur in subjects along with the sadhya in a variety of different ways. So it could be that you can find the hetu in everything that has the sadhya and everything that does not have the sadhya. So this would be thinking in terms of kind of like Western philosophy, so not Eastern philosophy. Thing is something that everything that is red is going to have, and everything that is non-red is going to have. So if hetu is thing and the Sadia is red, then you will find Heitus in everything that is a thing and or in everything that is red and in everything that is not red. They are all things. Oops. That quadrant is just one. There shouldn't have been a two. The second quadrant is it could occur in everything that is S and nothing that is non-S, or it could occur in everything that is S and some things that are non-S. So that's kind of the all S row. Possibly also it could occur in no S and all non-S. It could occur in no S and no non-S. So the Heitu just doesn't occur in anything at all. Or it could be in no S and some non-S. Finally, it could be that the Heitu occurs in some things that the Sadia occurs in, and all things that the Sadia doesn't occur in. Or it could be in some S and no non-S. Or it could be in some S and some non-S. So these are all of the different possible combinations of relationships between Sadias and Heitus. Now, if we were doing this properly in lecture, I would probably pause and tell you to talk with the person next to you, pick one of the rows or one of the columns, and try to come up with example Sadias and Heitus that illustrate this. So, for example, as I said, if Heitu is red and H is thing, if Sadia is red and Heitu is thing, then thing occurs in all red things and in all non-red things. And it's instructive to go through and try to come up with examples for all of these other cases. Some are more easy than others, some you kind of have to do weird manipulations with, but it's instructive. So if you really want to do this well, pause this video for 5 minutes, do your exercises, let me know in the comments what you come up with. I look forward to see what you have. But what is the relationship between this and what we've been talking about? This gives us an exhaustive list of ways in which the Heitu and the Sadia can be related to each other. But if you recall, the introduction of the Trirupa Heitu was intended to identify the cases in which we actually have a good grounding relation between the ground property and the target property. Now, if we want to be able to use this relationship to get us from the Heitu to the Sadia, then it's going to be very clear that some of these relations are not going to be useful or acceptable. So it has to be the case that the Heitu is actually present in some similar cases. So that is other cases where the Sadia is present. This means that nothing in this row is going to be a justified warrant. Any Heitu that doesn't occur in things that have the Sadia, not going to be acceptable for reasoning purposes. We also had that it can't occur in any places where S fails. So that means that this column is out because here the Heitu occurs in everything that is non-S. So there's clearly no connection between the Heitu and the Sadia. And over here, it's not quite as strong, but it's still the case that the Heitu could occur in some non-S things. So you can't really see very well because the videoing and the lighting and the colors and stuff, but this does leave us with two options. So either the Heitu occurs in everything in which the Sadia is present and nothing in which it is not, or it occurs in some things in which the Sadia is present and nothing in which it is not. So both of these cases are the ones that give us the articulation of the relationship between the Hetu and the Sadhya that allow us to make the move from the one to the other. So these are all of the possibilities. The Trirupa Hetu requirements are going to exclude all but the two that actually give us the grounding that we need to make our inference. Isn't that cool? We'll leave you to think about this lovely wheel for just a moment. You can always pause if you need to think more. These developments in Vasubandhu and Dignaga and Shankar Swamin were further developed and further articulated. The next person that we would talk about, if we actually had enough time to talk about these things in detail, would be the philosopher Dharmakirti, who was working in the 7th century. He was one of the most extensive writers on kind of formal epistemology and formal reasoning, all of these different means of inference, means of knowledge, not just inference, but perception, testimony, inference, analogy, all of these things together. And so Brendan Gillen, in his Stanford Encyclopedia article on logic in the classical Indian period, says that Dharmakirti's extensive writing on epistemology in general and on reason and argument in particular formed a watershed in classical Indian philosophy. If you want to kind of know where the pinnacle is, Dharmakirti is right up there at the top. Trying to do all of this in one lecture, we can't really say much about him. It's very interesting, I will say this, because the way in which Dharmakirti tries to take the kind of increasing systematization that we see moving from Vasubandhu up into Dignaga and Shankar Swamin, then fully articulating the power of the grounding relation, of the warrant that is being used in these arguments. It's very interesting because something happens whereby we begin to move from this epistemological level of talking about knowledge and uncertainty and kind of facts as far as we can tell, and moves it back to the ontological level. So Dharmakirti's developments actually bring us back closer to kind of what we've been used to in the Western traditions. But so I don't want to say more about that because we don't really have time. I want to go back to this idea of these systems of reasoning focusing on epistemology, means for knowledge rather than kind of a guide to factual truth in the world. If I say that there is fire on the mountain, and so there's our thesis, there's fire on the mountain. Fire on the mountain. And you ask me why? Why do I think that? And I say, well, because there's smoke. And I'm going to give you a warrant for my inference. Where there is smoke, there is fire. Note importantly that I'm not arguing the other way around. I don't go from fire to smoke because it's perfectly capable to have fire without smoke. But the other way around, so essentially going from the effect back to the cause, the only way that you would have smoke is if there was some fire that caused it. Now, suppose that I put forward this thesis and you've asked me what my justification is and I give you my ground and I assert the warrant. Now, you come back and say, that wasn't actually smoke that you saw, that was fog. Now suddenly, the warrant still holds because there is this positive concomitance, this pervasion between smoke and fire. But the ground has been removed. All of a sudden, I'm now in a position where I can't make this assertion or where I need to withdraw my assent to it or to stop believing, stop having knowledge that there is fire on the mountain. So this is the notion in which this sort of system is revisable and epistemological, because we could be wrong about our grounds. However, the reason why this is still a useful sort of system to develop is that until someone comes along and tells me that that smoke was fog, I am justified in my assertion, in my belief that there is fire on the mountain. It is only in the presence of defeating information that I am no longer justified. So it's not that I didn't have a good argument. I did have a good argument. It's just that new information came to light. And this is much more in keeping with how it is that we actually kind of argue and interact with each other in ordinary situations or in philosophical situations. You can have a good argument for something. You can be justified in maintaining a position, even though it's possible that something might come along and give you defeaters. So I would like to say something generally about what is going on in these sorts of systems. So we talked a lot about target properties and the subjects, but we can make this more explicit. So if I were to say, what is this system of logic about? It is going to be about properties and locations. So these locations are not like spatial locations. They are the objects in which the properties are located. So we are interested in like the property of fire being located on the mountain. Now that happens to be a spatial location, but think back to the pot example. So the property of being non-eternal is located in the pot. Now you might sit here and think, but this sounds a lot like what predicate logic is about properties and objects. So we have variables, we have individual constants, and we can predicate things of these individuals via one-place predicates or by binary or higher order relations. So are these systems of logic kind of doing the same sort of thing? I would like to try to make the case that the answer is no. So it's important that what we're talking about here is locations rather than objects that have properties, because this is what allows us to make sense of the pervasion relation, this idea that these two properties are always co-located with each other. It's not that the objects that have them are always the same things, but it's just that anytime, any location that has one of these properties will have another one of these properties, regardless of what these locations are themselves in. So what we've got here is a logic that has as its building blocks properties and locations. So let's write this up here, properties and locations. And I'm just going to put together a couple millennia of developments and traditions and just call this Indian logic. We can contrast this with predicates and objects, which are the building blocks of predicate logic. And we can contrast this with propositions, the building blocks of propositional logic, and terms and quantification, which are the building blocks of the syllogism. Now, the other piece that I had you read for this week, and for anybody else, this is an introduction to a chapter, an introduction to a book on Indian philosophy by Jonathan Ganeri, and it is about Indian philosophy and the colonization of reasoning. And it's a really interesting chapter because it talks about kind of the historiography of how it was that Western scholars first got access to the texts in which this sort of material is found in. So it goes back to the early 19th century. So in 1824, H.T. Colebrook, sorry, there's an E on the end, Colebrook, gave a report to the Royal Asiatic Society of his discovery of what he called the Hindu syllogism. So I'm going to put that up with the scare quotes. the differences between kind of the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition in this sort of area have to do with the means of knowledge that are accepted and also with the particular details of how you put together the argument form. I'm not going to say more about that now. But so he described this as a schema for correct reasoning as described in an early Indian text. About a century later, a guy named H.N. Randall also published a paper on the Indian syllogism in the journal Mind. And these papers and Colebrook's talk were relevant because there was a sense in which Western philosophers had to figure out how to fit this into their scheme of them. In particular, Colebrook's lecture challenged this idea that, and this is a quote from Untitled Chapter, that Europe, as a consequence of its classical cultural inheritance, had a privileged position of intellectual authority. And so one of the problems was whether Colebrook's discovery could be made consistent with the European self-understanding of its intellectual superiority over its colonies. So put this in the context of the 19th century. You have the British Empire colonizing India and various other places, and one of the justifications for why it can do this is because, and I'm putting 19th century words into my mouth that I do not believe, because Europeans were intellectually superior than the people that they were colonizing. Part of this intellectual superiority gets traced back to Aristotle, to the syllogism that we started off this class with. But now they're in a position where it's like, look, there is this Hindu syllogism or this Indian syllogism that is going back to texts at least as old as Aristotle, possibly older. A lot of these developments, it's hard to say exactly when they were written or when they came into being. And this is a threat to European intellectual superiority. If the Indians developed a syllogism, just like Aristotle did, then tracing our intellectual history back to Aristotle doesn't necessarily make us superior anymore. This is problematic if you are a 19th century British colonialist. So, one thing that we might ask is, what is the purpose in calling this a syllogism? There is this implicit then connection, whether intended or not, with the Aristotelian syllogisms that we have looked like before. What would happen, though, if we tried to take, say, the fire on the mountain argument and turn it into a syllogism? So, recall that what we have is thesis, and then ground, and then warrant, possibly with some examples, possibly with some reiteration of the thesis. Now, suppose that we tried to make this into a syllogism. Well, we might get something like, some mountain is a smoky thing. So, mountain being one term, smoky thing being another term. Then we've got every smoky thing is a fiery thing. Therefore, we can conclude some mountain is a fiery thing. And if we reorder these premises so that the major premise is first, what we get is an instance of the syllogism Darii, one of the classic perfect syllogisms. But is this a good rendering of the original argument? There's many reasons to think that it's not. First of all, it completely removes this idea of properties being located in particular subjects. We're now talking about relationships between terms. We have to talk about fiery things rather than about fire. Second of all, in all of the various articulations of the Indian argument form, the thesis comes first. So even just at the level of order of propositions, it gets it wrong. So this doesn't seem to be a good rendition of what's going on in these in these anumana inferences, even if this might be, like, say, co-valid, so that this argument will be a good argument if and only if the other one is, this doesn't mean that this is a good rendition of what's going on in the original syllogism. So, one thing that you might want to say is that if the Indian philosophers were trying to develop syllogisms, given how much we have to, like, change things over in order to get it to look like this, they did a bad job. Now, that would be one way that you could kind of retain your European intellectual authority and say, look, well, they were trying to do Aristotelian syllogisms, but, they just didn't do a very good job. Or, much more interesting, is to say, but this isn't a syllogism. We've already given some reasons why not. It's about properties and locations rather than about terms and quantification. There's this different sort of structure. So perhaps actually the problem is trying to shoehorn this into the syllogisms when it's just not. It's not Aristotle. Why should we expect it to be Aristotle? What would happen then if, for instance, instead of looking at this as properties and locations, we think of it in terms of predicates and objects. Maybe this will actually make more sense of what is going on. So we could say something like, well, every smoky thing is a fiery thing. Then this particular mountain is smoky, therefore this particular mountain is fiery. And then this is kind of has in the background this suppressed premise of universal generalization from that premise. So again, this has an advantage over kind of the syllogistic rendition in that we can talk about the mountain that we are interested in, so it's not just some mountain as we had in the syllogistic version. We are talking about the actual mountain named M, and we can say something about kind of this pervasion relation that you're always going to get, that smoke is always implying fire. So we're not talking about smoky things and fiery things, we're talking about smoke and fire. But this still doesn't seem to capture what is going on in the Indian syllogism. Again, it has the things in the wrong order. We start off with the assertion that the mountain is fiery. And then we walk through the steps that provide us the justification for this. This is an important clue to the idea that we are not looking so much at facts about the world or the structure of truth, but we are trying to give epistemological foundations for certain assertions that we would like to make. So what I hope I have justified in these two videos is that we are working with a fundamentally different approach towards formal reasoning, which is just as good in terms of providing reliable inferences, providing us foundations with our foundations for our knowledge, as the Western ontic traditions are. So the idea that these are syllogisms, or you can shoehorn it into predicate logic, but that it doesn't do it very well, is reason for us to kind of be very careful about the sorts of claims that we're trying to make about these developments. That in fact, really, what is being done in this system is just fundamentally different from what we do in logic in the Western tradition. And yet, that's only if you take logic in this very narrow sort of formal deductive validity sort of approach. If what we are interested in is the study of good arguments, then these are good arguments. And we are given formal structures that we can look at. We are given precise examples that we can analyze. We are given rules for which instantiations of the formal structure are good ones or not. So the idea that Western intellectual superiority is threatened by the existence of a wholly distinct, unique, and utterly acceptable and reliable method of argumentation. If this threatens Western intellectual superiority, well, good. Because this idea that we have a privileged access to what it is that we are doing simply because we are inheriting it from Aristotle is a really narrow-minded sort of view to take. Now, I've got to bring this to a close, otherwise my computer is going to crash again. What I would like to say is that this only scratches the tip of what you can do in this context. If anybody is interested in more reading, in primary texts that have been translated, in some of the work that I've done myself looking at kind of formal structures of these argumentation systems, drop me a message in the comments. If you know my email, send me an email. I would love to give you more references and to talk about this more. In the meantime, this was Dr. Logic awkwardly does logic in her office with a whiteboard, somewhat more awkwardly than she expected to, but I hope you have learned something. I hope it's been interesting. I hope you've been able to read the whiteboard. This wasn't how I wanted to end my teaching year, but thank you all for being a part of it, and good luck with all your exams. Cheers.